we're going to talk about what we would refer to as naked cloud computing, which is a sort of fairly nebulous concept. But I think the key thing we want to sort of open up is really kind of sort of peel back the discussion about cloud computing and talk about more at a fundamental level and less at a sort of my understanding thus far of cloud computing is the following, or my experience of cloud computing is the following. And sort of peel it back and say, well, actually you're looking for, what are the things that are going to matter to you? And then let's kind of build it up from there. So obviously, I'm going to talk a little bit about Interoute, because I'm guessing a bunch of folks will not have heard of Interoute as an organization. So a quick, brief introduction. I'll be mercifully brief. Interoute is Europe's, if you like, largest cloud platform for two very simple reasons. We are literally the mother of most networks in Europe. If you think about it, the Interoute, a third of all the long-haul internet capacity last year in the European continent as such, defined by Nordics down to the Mediterranean and as far east as the Russian border, was Interoute. So many of the brands you know, many of the brands you love, that's all Interoute. And in addition to that, we have customers who rely on us every day for their corporate services. So we're a very, very large footprint. And our customers range everything from governments, people who are very, very sensitive about data, very concerned about how it's controlled, very concerned about where it's placed, up to more familiar names. You'll see the likes of BMW, Volvo, these sorts of folks. And it varies in large corporations, large service providers in equal measure. And critical to our approach to this market is a thing we called unified ICT. And it's dead, dead simple, right? From an IT perspective, all we're saying is that the model of buying a bunch of boxes from a bunch of well-known vendors, getting a bunch of suits, so boxes and suits, spending 3 years to get something to work, and then starting the whole process again, doesn't fit well in 2012, right? What we're talking about is the technology, the capability, and the assets are there to allow you to get far more sophisticated, far more immediate delivery of services. You've seen it with cloud computing in the public cloud, but what we're doing is bringing that in its entirety into the enterprise. So we're talking about connectivity, we're talking about communications, and we're talking about computing. And the other thing we're talking about, in the same way that you've seen the revolution in things like the App Store from the likes of Apple, where we buy more point-based solutions, we're seeing the same things in the enterprise. I don't want to go through a 2 or 3 year cycle to discover my security portfolio. I want a cyber threat management service I can test and I can use instantly. This kind of more immediate model. If you think about it, in 2012, you wouldn't buy a car today from a guy who said, we'll work through this together, you tell me what you want, and in 2.5 years' time, it should be running like an absolute gem, right? You wouldn't do it, but with IT, we do it all the time. So what we're talking about is a much more immediate, clear away the decks way of thinking about it, but without compromising how you think about your services. So, where do we find ourselves in 2011? I would argue we're confused, right? I've had several conversations out on the floor. I've had several conversations with customers. I mentioned the words cloud and computing, and bang, instantly, they assume something, right? Why? It happens at the beginning of all industries. People are sort of saying, no, this is my definition of the cloud. This is what cloud computing is about. It has to be about the internet. It has to be about elastic computing. No, it must be about how you migrate to it. All of this is what Gartner would call the hype cycle, right? People desperately trying to grab the agenda from one another. What we can say is that there is a debate, right? There is a debate between the public cloud and what people will arguably now call the private cloud. And I think to characterize it, in the public cloud, people would say, I love the speed and simplicity of it. And we know, because we have customers of it, that what they've done is they've foregone some of that natural sort of security that they would have in order to get the public cloud, in order to get that immediacy of asset, in order to move IT is so much more convenient. So the difference also between the real and the virtual is disappearing. People saying, oh, well, that application won't work on there because it's virtualized, is less and less. To the extent that probably when you come back to this event in 2 or 3 years' time, it won't even be a conversation you're having with anyone. If you go over to the private cloud, what's the motivation there? The motivation there is, I want to get more out of the asset I've got, and I do not want to have to compromise the way I think about my IT security. But the trouble with that, to work with one organization we know very well, it isn't pay as you go. So what it means, you're still buying an asset. So when someone says, build your own private cloud, really what they're saying is, buy the same piece of equipment from me, stick it in your data center, you're still not paying for it in a more effective way. You're still paying for an awful lot of the storage you don't use. Typically, you buy a terabyte, 250 gig is what you'll end up actually consuming of that. So it's incredibly inefficient. And even when you try and virtualize it and crank it up, then you run against the problem that stopped you from using the public cloud, contention. You're concerned about performance. So you've kind of got this kind of split way of thinking about the problem. So where do we see the debate moving forward? I think there's 4 key areas as far as we've seen and others have sort of articulated. Security, right? Overcome the concerns that stop people moving into some form of cloud infrastructure. I recently asked the CIO of a very large audit company customer of ours, I said cloud computing. Before I'd got the word computing out my mouth, he said, we can't use the cloud. I said, why is that? He said, it's not secure. It's in the internet, it's bad. And I said, whoa, 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 what's your understanding of the cloud? We walked him through it, and it boiled down to, he said, where's my data? I said, you have your data anywhere. Ah, well, okay, well, you know, maybe I could. Where is it sitting? It's in your network. And you start to understand that people associate certain things, make a bunch of assumptions, which largely are incorrect. So security is a big one. Compliance, as I said, keep your auditors happy. Most IT managers would agree, it's far easier to make a technical architecture decision if you know at audit time you're not going to have to sit down with a bunch of accountants who don't understand what you do for a living and explain to them what the changes are and how things are still good, right? So that you can preserve your system-based audit and not have to go back to something far more complex. So compliance becomes increasingly an issue here. Integration. How do I get to how do I use this cost base? How do I really drive myself out by using this? And this is a key thing. What you've got is probably a well-managed IT infrastructure. What you really don't want to do is then suddenly find that, well, I could put parts of it into a separate cloud. But then I've got to think, well, I can't really put part of my IT infrastructure in because I may have latency between application layers. What I end up doing is I end up finding that I've got to either put all of it in and then worry about putting everything in one place, or I've got to build some kind of compromised platform. So integration, how you can build hybrid systems, is a key thing. And then architecture. It is way, way too early these days to say, I know what the architecture of a cloud platform should look like. We don't know, right? What you do know is that you should not be constrained by choices you make in 2012 that will affect you in 4 or 5 years' time when you're moving forward. So you want something that's open, extensible, and not bound up in possibly rational to them, but irrational motivation behind how architectures develop. You're looking for something nice and clean. Before we drive on this, I just want to bring us back to one of the less well-known parts of the cloud computing. No one who is in cloud computing doesn't have some form of network, in the same way that no one who has a network doesn't have some form of computing. But most people, and I would take a straw poll, don't know what a network is. And you say this and people go, oh, don't be ridiculous, I know what a network is. You know, it's most people, when they think about enterprise networks, are bound up in this picture. 1999. There was no in the network. It didn't exist as a concept. People built transport networks peer-to-peer between locations. And then quietly over time, what's happened is a thing called MPLS arrived as IP and the internet was becoming mainstream. And that allowed us to get any-to-any connectivity, but securely. And then we thought, well, hang on, that's IP. I can put things in the network to improve my routing, reduce my costs, maximize performance. So people started to move things into the network. And this steady migration has continued. to the point now where the idea of placing stuff outside of the network for an enterprise user is utterly illogical from a physics perspective, from an economic perspective, from a compliance perspective, from a security perspective. All you're doing is you're putting it in the wrong end of the network, because the most expensive part of any network is the bit that you pay for to get to the thing that is running your network from. It is always going to be, and it's also the most constrained part. So from a cost perspective, if you look back about someone like an Interoute, if we can serve the likes of Telefonica and Google, we're going to be fairly cost effective in delivering network across a platform for you. So MPLS has now become, if you like, to quote IDC, the linchpin of WAN connectivity. That's what most people use, because it's the same speed, it's the same simplicity, it's the same price, but it's secure. So this idea that this type of networking technology is expensive is fundamentally incorrect. And the idea that this is, oh, that must be private, is incorrect. We have very large customers who run huge web presence, UEFA being one. The Euro is coming up, one of the largest web presence events this year. And they run both public and private using these kind of techniques. So the network finally is the computer. Those of you old enough to remember who said that, I've been doing a straw poll and so far doing really badly. I realize I talk to people much younger than myself. But those of you who remember Mark Andreessen, 1996, the network is the computer, poor bloke, he's finally right. It did take much longer than he thought, you know, a good old 16-year wait, but you know, good things come for those of us who wait. So finally, the network is the computer, and it's fundamental that what you've got to think about when you think about cloud computing is cloud computing is network. There's no point in Westfield building the best shopping center in the world if they don't have adequate infrastructure to get to that shopping center, right?